Hello, everybody. Today I'm joined by Mark Latham, and we're going to be discussing his upcoming fantasy game, Lasting Tales, for Blacklist Miniatures. So, welcome to the show, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's good to be here.
It's always a pleasure to talk to a games designer that I appreciate. And based on the volumes on my shelves, I certainly appreciate your work. So, I suppose the first thing people want to know is, what is Lasting Tales? It's a fantasy miniatures game, but what way would you pitch it to people?
I describe this game as a mashup between a traditional skirmish game and a dungeon crawler. Kind of what I mean by that is it's a solo and co-op exclusively. It's about creating heroes. It's about leveling up. It's about doing all those cool things, if you remember, stuff like Advanced Hero Quest and Warhammer Quest and even D&D. But you get to play on an open world skirmish table rather than having a kind of a board game element to it. So yes, it's a true kind of genre mashup, and that's the hook.
Yeah, I suppose whenever I was looking through the copy of the demo rules, the thing that struck me is I would almost view it as a proper skirmish game, which will probably upset and offend some people there. But a lot of times you see games listed as being skirmish games simply because they only use a couple of models. But in reality, you're not doing anything differently than you would if you were playing a warband or squad-based game or another tabletop game. There's nothing that is granular enough to me to really define it as a skirmish game, whereas this has a lot of actions and activities that the players can take. It does blur the lines between a miniature game and an RPG to a large extent. So was this a sort of an overriding theme that you wanted to bring in from the start? Was this something that you were asked to try and aim towards, this mashup, this blur between RPG and tabletop?
Yeah, that's kind of the brief for the game. Basically, the saddling background in gaming that I do. So our kind of touchstones of gaming history were the same. So as soon as we started talking about, we really like Warhammer Quest, we really like D&D and Pathfinder, we want to do a skirmish game that kind of invokes those things. And I was just instantly thinking, Mordheim and Necromunda and even my own stuff like Legend of the Old West and all those kind of campaign-based, character-based games that I've always kind of striven to design. That we've totally on the same page. That's what this game is going to be about.
Fantastic. So it's a fantasy cooperative game, but it can be played from solo to 5 players. The party members, I suppose, within that, they follow the sort of the standard fantasy tropes, I suppose.
Yeah, very much. We want to make it miniatures agnostic, so whatever models you've got in your collection, you can use for this. So we try to get as many races and classes of the traditional fantasy tropes that we can think of. In fact, so many that we've got to hold some back. So I think we're going to do an expansion later with some more races and sub-races and subclasses and all that kind of stuff. But we're starting off with 5 races and 10 classes, and you can have any combination of the above. So we're not limiting at all. You can have a dwarf paladin or a half orc thief or whatever you want to take.
And I suppose within that as well, people have the carte blanche, I suppose, to go in and tweak things and change things if they want to, as is their want. But I noticed there's just a little text box that says followers, and there's nothing more about it in the demo system.
Yeah.
but it does say it will be possible to recruit hirelings, and they have a limited role. So are they just going to be your squires to carry treasure around with you, or have you already started to work on those sort of roles within your party?
So followers, firstly, if you're playing a one-off game, because there's various ways to play the game. So if you're going to play a one-off adventure, you're not interested in a campaign, you can use followers as kind of make weights. So you can think, I want to play against a bigger enemy force, but I've only got 1 or 2 heroes. What do I do? So you choose a load of followers. So you can have mercenaries and foot guards and constables and the innkeeper or the squire, like you say. You can just take whatever you want from your collection. If you're playing the campaign, then there are some that you can recruit, and there are some that will join you as part of narrative events. But followers are a great way to just have more models in your party. They're not very important in the grand scheme of things. They can't do a lot of the heroic actions, and often they need to be commanded by a hero. So you don't take them instead of, you take them as well as. And all followers kind of swear an oath to follow a particular hero who is their patron, and only he can command that follower, for example. But yeah, it's just a great way of just getting more models in a party. They're quite low-level guys as well.
So everybody needs meat shields and chaff to throw at banshees when they come screaming out of the depths, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Oh, well.
It's kind of inspired by Advanced Hero Quest in that respect. You know, when you get your mercenary men-at-arms kind of following you around, it's that kind of thing. Someone's to carry the treasure back to town.
More miniatures on the tabletop's always good. And even if they just give a slight bonus, they can be a game changer. I suppose then people want to know, as far as game terms go, you've said that there's more than one way to play. What are the sort of the definitions or the ways that people can get their miniatures onto the tabletop?
So the way that most people will play is going to be the kind of pickup game, I think. So your one party ones, you can level them up if you like in advance and just take a more advanced party. You can hire followers. Once you set the level of your party, like the experience and size of it, then you work out the enemies that you fight. And you just roll a random scenario from the, how many have I written? 18? So from the 18 scenarios in the book, roll a random scenario and just play. The way that the game is kind of geared towards playing, though, is the tale, or as you call it, a campaign. If you've played Mordheim or Warhammer Quest, you will recognize the format. Right? You play a game, you roll for injuries for your heroes, you recruit followers, you roll for events depending on where you are. If you're in a town, you roll on the town events. If you're in the wilderness, you roll on the wilderness events. You buy new gear, you heal up, and then you go to the next adventure. When you've got enough experience, you level up in between time. So that's kind of the really fun part of playing is the campaign. And then the third and final way to play is the narrative tale. And this is something Brady Sadler is going to be writing, so one of the Sadler brothers from Blacklist. And he's kind of written a lot of the world building background stuff. So he's going to write a narrative tale, which is all of these random things that I've written for randomly generating a scenario, randomly generating events, randomly generating injuries. All of that stuff might be scripted in a narrative tale. To basically have, you're going to play this specific scenario, and it's been modified to match the storyline. Now, when you've played that, this event will happen. Or if you lose, you'll trigger a different event in a different scenario. So it's much more of a scripted, almost GM'd experience. You can write it ahead of time with your friends. You can just use the ones that we provide. I'm sure there'll be more in the future. There's definitely going to be one of those in the book.
That's interesting because when I was looking through the way the demo adventure goes in the actual book itself, there are a few things in there, including events. So the events that happen in game, but there are also then events that can happen when your party's in the sort of the campaign part. Is that how it works out? So just because you're not currently fighting on a specific tabletop doesn't necessarily mean that your party's going to be A-okay just because it's mid-game?
Yeah, so in the demo rules, that scenario, which is the Village of the Damned, necromancer-based scenario. So that scenario is actually an example of a narrative game. So that might actually be in Brady's narrative tale. We just wanted something really fun that kind of shows off all of the story aspects of the game. When you roll up a random scenario, a procedurally generated one, you still have an event table, but it's based on your environment. There are 3 environments in the game. These are settlement, wilderness, and dungeon, and each one has its own events table. And you trigger unexpected events. It's basically the roll a 1 phase, as we used to call it. So in the events phase, if you roll a 1, you get an unexpected event. Or if the wizard miscasts, you get an unexpected event. And something happens from this table. But in a narrative tale, that table is modified or replaced by the scenario. So hence in the Village of the Damned, zombies might rise up, or
Right.
the necromancer has an extra spell, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so it adds a certain theme to it depending on what the story is that people are playing out.
Yeah.
And those can be quite brutal. I've noticed it's like Kevin McAllister has been hiding traps in places. The massive steel spike to the head is particularly vicious, I feel.
Yeah, I like that one. I'm not 100% finished with the trap design yet, so they may be too brutal. But then you can't.
I'm quite prepared to watch people take that.
You can't. It's weird when you're doing a game with leveling involved, because something that might kill a level 1 character would barely scratch a level 10 character.
Or bounce off them, yeah.
Yeah, so there's got to be a way of leveling traps. So I'm kind of working on that at the moment.
So with that in mind, then, how much of the book is fully formed already, and is there expansion within the Kickstarter campaign for the book from yourself, or have you already got just here is the rules that will come out regardless of how successful the campaign is? Because I know sometimes you can get games that are almost reliant on a successful campaign to add parts to books. And you get very either light core rules, or they expect that X, Y, and Z will be added when they reach these stretch goals, and if they don't, then you get a much smaller finished product than you would ordinarily expect.
Yeah, I think we're all pretty insistent on having a big full color book, so I don't think we're going to have a smaller book if the funding isn't as great as we'd expect, although we've got a pretty good interest already. So in terms of rules, the core rules I think are fairly locked down. I've got the structure sorted out. I've kind of written most of a first draft now. The scenarios, I'm committed to writing 18 scenarios, and there will be that campaign section. I think at the Kickstarter, if we smash a load of goals, then we're almost certainly going to be able to afford more kind of writing resource from other places, which may well mean having more narrative scenarios and narrative content. So I think that's where we'll flesh out those stretch goals. But at the moment, we've got the rules, we've got the campaign, we're going to have one narrative campaign. Anything else is gravy, as we say.
It's good to hear. So mechanically then, I suppose obviously we've talked about what the game is and what you're aiming for, but mechanically, how would a game play out then? So it's being played on at least a 3-foot board, so sort of kitchen table.
Yeah, we kind of 3x3 is like the industry standard now. We didn't want to deviate from that really. Because a lot of people buy game mats these days, which fit on a dining table quite nicely.
Yeah.
So we kind of go, let's get the most common size game mat and use that. And as we've tested it, I've kind of made sure everything fits that size. And as we've tested it, we think bigger, you might get a bit lost with a small party of heroes, but smaller, it's just a bit too dangerous because the lowliest goblin can snipe you. So it kind of gets a little bit. So 3x3 is absolutely ideal. It's good for game time as well. I think if you're all kind of moving roughly 6 inches and you're firing roughly 12 inches, then it locks you into a certain round limit. Kind of, so games kind of last about 10 rounds or maybe an hour, and it's kind of ideal.
Yeah, it's a good evening's play. When you're playing through, so the turn sequence itself will be familiar to most tabletop game players. It's a hero's phase, and then the adversaries, then the events, is it? Or events, then adversaries?
Events and adversaries.
Events and adversaries. So you follow a sort of standard structure, but within that there were a few little tweaks that I quite liked, and one of which is when adversaries get removed from play, they don't always just go into a big pile of dead. Instead, you have this sort of graveyard, and then it's a stepping stone into a spawn point or a spawn pool that means they could come back again, which is an intriguing way of doing things where you know that you've got at least a turn's grace after you've removed somebody. And potentially they may not come back if the dice rolls are particularly low, but at some point the floodgates will open. So you can't always depend that just because you've cleared the board of enemies currently doesn't mean they won't suddenly come flooding back in, especially when you're attempting to do something integral to the story or scenario. Was that a limiting factor that you brought in specifically? Because it is cooperative / solo play, so you're always reliant on the AI monsters coming for you to make it an interesting game.
Precisely. I think it's possible if you're the kind of min-max player that we kind of don't encourage with a game like this, because it's a storytelling game.
Yeah.
If you can wipe out the adversary force and focus on just killing all the enemies and win that way rather than doing your objectives. But with the spawn mechanic, because there's always going to be some monsters coming back, whether it's a trickle or a flood, and you sometimes have wandering monsters called lurkers, who are bigger, hungrier monsters who just randomly appear. That kind of encourages you to focus on your objectives. So because there's no point trying to wipe everyone out, because you almost whereas if you go for your objectives and try and just kind of manage the threat around that area, you're much more likely to succeed.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things that I really enjoyed from the likes of The Walking Dead, which you worked on. That AI mechanic was very simple in The Walking Dead. In this, it's slightly more complicated because you don't just have things that will engage in melee. You've got various types of creatures that will do specific types of attacks, whether it's ranged or melee, or sometimes they may stumble around the corner into you because they couldn't see you to shoot you. So having a solid foundation for an AI mechanic is obviously very important, but there's still pieces within the gameplay itself which helps the narrative idea, with the fact that one of the actions is taunt. So just because somebody is about to take the head off a poor halfling thief doesn't mean the paladin can't taunt it to force it to redirect its attacks towards that, and it lends itself to the storytelling aspect a lot more than just sort of a standard I charge, therefore I fight now sort of mechanic.
What I really didn't want to do is have a super complex AI. I've written super complex AIs before, but it does slow down gameplay quite a bit. So what I wanted to do is have something really simple, not as simple as The Walking Dead, because there's more than just zombies in this one, but just a really simple set of like a 3-step process for melee baddies and a 3-step process for ranged baddies. Kind of leave it there. But then you modify it in lots of different ways. The scenarios can modify it. Some of the monsters and things have special rules that modify it. Like the necromancer in the demo scenario has his own special ability, which is his necromancer spells, which he does when he activates, and that affects how all the other monsters around him activate. So I'm getting a lot of interviews this end. I do apologise.
No, that's all right.
And then the scenarios can affect adversary activations, and then there are ways for the heroes to also manage the threat by taunting and dragging them towards you, or by casting spells which can kind of mind control them later in the late game. So lots of little ways to modify it, but a really simple core, and I think that's kind of the important design aspect for adversaries.
The initial Blacklist Miniatures fantasy series Kickstarter sort of blew up massively, so that they have a wealth of miniatures and also sort of scenery pieces and that sort of thing. Were they the core of your construct for the system, or I know you said it was going to be agnostic, but did they look at it and go, well, we've got giants and dragons, so you need to have rules in there for these massive figure pieces that people sort of love to get their hands on, or is it just a sort of a sketch where you're going, well, these are the fantasy things that may exist, and therefore I'll fill in the blanks to your heart's content?
Well, the former, really. So basically, there's a bestiary section in this book, which is going to be pretty huge. I think there's 100 adversaries in it so far, thereabouts. So basically, we've got stats for every single model from Fantasy Series 1 and 2.
Right.
And hopefully there'll be Fantasy Series 3 at some point, and we'll put some more stuff in there. But because those Fantasy Series miniatures cover such a huge range of fantasy archetypes, you can pretty much find rules for whatever you've got in your collection. There aren't many things that we're missing, actually. We try to get everything in there, so that if you've got a dragon already in your collection, you can use that dragon. If you've got gas serpents, if they exist in anyone else's range, then you can use those ones. It's fine. but if not, you've got this big box of stuff in the Kickstarter, and you can use all of them straight away. That was really important to us.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. Sometimes they look not out of place, but they look heroic when you're playing on a small board and you're playing a small skirmish game. And yes, you expect to see waves of zombies, kobolds coming scuttling out of the darkness. That's all grand. And then somebody puts a big monster down, like a giant or like a troll or a dragon.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're going, oh my lord, I didn't expect to see one of those here. And having to deal with that is a whole other kettle of fish, I suppose, for the heroes.
It's interesting because in this game, you do choose your enemies. So you get to choose the adversary force.
Right.
But it's based on the level of your party. So the bigger and more experienced the party, the bigger and more experienced the monsters. And then you also have some scenarios with the lurker mechanic, which is your wandering monster. That tends to be a single figure that's a higher level than all the other monsters in play. At least as high a level as the best hero.
Right.
And that appears as an unexpected event. It might not appear at all. You might be really lucky and never roll a 1, so it never appears. But most people find it appears in the first turn because it's the roll a 1 phase. So it just rocks up. And that's where your giants and dragons go into play.
To be fair, if there's a chance of me rolling a 1, I will take it 9 times out of 10. Especially if I'm not supposed to. Are there any plans to add in any of the specific scenery pieces that Blacklist have made? Did you look at it because they've got some nice things like obviously weapon racks and that sort of thing that you find in any dungeon are always nice just to dress the set, but there's really nice sort of fountains and strange magical artifacts. Or have you concentrated just solely on the monsters and gameplay itself and not worried too much about you must have a magical mirror to hang on the wall to summon a Banshee Queen?
Well, where I've written specific objectives, I've made sure that we can provide it. Or there are rules in the book for proxying it somehow.
All right.
I've tried not to be too specific. The narrative tale will have all that stuff in it. The generic ones, I've tried to make it so that if you don't have any of the Blacklist scenery, you can still play the game. So like there's a scenario that needs a cart, but I've got to specify, look, the cart is roughly these dimensions. If you don't have the one that's going to come with Fantasy Series 2, or it's by Blacklight Studios, then it's these dimensions. You can have a pile of crates, you have a pile of barrels, it can be whatever you like. It's just got to represent some cool supplies. So yeah, all those little bits of scenery are great for scatter, and they will have a use in the narrative stuff. But I've tried not to be too specific because I think it's a big turn-off for people to have a specific type of scenery to set up a game. You want to be able to have roughly generic enough instructions to set up a board with the scenery that you've got. And so that's kind of what I've gone for in the main 18 scenarios.
I suppose then the narrative campaign can flex and grow based on what happens during the Kickstarter campaign as well, which is always interesting,
exactly.
Especially when somebody else is having to write that. Your work here is done. You can just go, yeah.
Yeah, if Brady goes wild and decides he wants to make the magic waterfall of ever living, if you knock yourself out, guys, you've got to find someone to make that big waterfall. You can do what he likes.
Yeah, it's the best.
I don't have to worry about that, do I? So.
No. Well, it's a fascinating looking set of rules, Mark. I'm really intrigued because it does beautifully blur the line between miniature and RPG, and the fact that the whole premise is for people to be telling their own lasting tales for their groups means there's definitely room for a lot of expansion and exploration within that world. I'm looking forward to seeing exactly how it develops and hopefully actually getting it on the tabletop and getting some games in as well.
I look forward to that too, actually. It's been a long process.
Well, folks, Lasting Tales is currently on Kickstarter. If you are interested, take a look. We'll drop the links in below. If you have any questions about the gameplay or about Lasting Tales itself that you want to ask Mark, if you drop them into the comments below here, I'll do my best to pass them on and see whether or not we can get an answer for you. Till the next time, Mark, it's been a pleasure.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.